What if borderline intensity and narcissistic control are not opposites, but two solutions to the same early disruption? Why do some people need emotional chaos and turbulence to feel connected, while others need to control to feel safe? What if your earliest attachment figure wasn't experienced as comforting or consistent, but as disruptive, scary, or chaotic? Today, we're focusing on how emotional turbulence becomes attachment for some, while also touching on how emotional control becomes safety for others. Hello everyone, welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. In today's episode, I want to take you behind the scenes again and really let you into my thinking process as I prepare material for my personality disorders class. I've been working on a series looking at borderline and narcissistic personality organization, how they overlap, where they diverge, and most importantly, how they represent different solutions to similar early developmental problems. What I want to do today is start with material that is very clearly borderline, drawn from a renowned psychoanalyst, Christopher Bollas, and then use it as a contrast point to help us understand how narcissistic functioning responds to a similar problem, but in a very different way. If that doesn't make sense, sit tight. I promise you, I'm going to break it all down over the course of this episode. So this episode is really about two psychic strategies. One that seeks turbulence and chaos to feel connected, and the other that seeks control, to never have to genuinely need another person at all. Can you guess which one is related to narcissist as compared to borderline organization? You see, the one that seeks turbulence and chaos is more borderline. And of course, control has more to do with a narcissistic tendency. But again, I'm going to break this down as we go along. To understand why these two strategies, the turbulence or the control, to understand how they develop, we have to go back to the earliest relationship, as the personality is just beginning to develop. And this is where the work of Christopher Bollas becomes especially useful. We have to ask an important and fundamental question. What was the earliest attachment experienced like? In other words, what was your experience with your earliest attachment figure, typically a parental figure? Christopher Bollas asks us to consider something very specific, but very unsettling. What if the primary object, he says, is not well-intentioned, but instead is experienced as disruptive, and therefore represented not as a stable, loving image, but as emotional turmoil? In other words, what if the earliest attachment figure is not something you can take in, hold on to, or internalize in a comforting way, but is instead experienced as disruptive? If that's the case, then emotional states begin to take the place of the parental figure. Feeling itself becomes the closest thing to having the parent present. Again, I'll break this down as we go along, but let me just reiterate it. Feelings are the attachment. In other words, the child cannot rely on a consistent, comforting presence. So the inner world is constantly keyed to the emotional turbulence of the caregiver. So it's not necessarily an internalization of the caregiver, him or herself, but to the feeling that they elicit. That's what begins to get internalized and carried forth. As a result of this early instability, both borderline and narcissistic organizations share some fundamental features. There is a lack of object constancy. You've heard me mention this in all the prior episodes. It constantly comes up. So there's a lack of object constancy, a fragile internal sense of continuity, and a heightened sensitivity to any relational disruption. In practical terms, this shows up in daily experience in a few ways. The present feels heavy and unresolved. The future feels blank, scary, or overwhelming. This is what we sometimes call existential dread. And there's no internalized sense that situations can naturally move towards resolution. These patterns often reflect early environments where problems and anxieties were never truly settled, where a caregiver could be unpredictable, suddenly absent, could come home intoxicated, and chaos was recurrent rather than temporary. So, if your earliest experiences were like this, if safety, comfort, and predictability were unreliable, how does your mind try to make sense of the world and the people in it? How do you relate to others when your internal world focuses on what? Constant turbulence and instability. See, that's what's most familiar. And again, I mentioned this a moment ago, but that's what gets internalized. Turbulence and instability, chaos. This, in psychoanalytic terms, is what we call borderline relating. So, what is borderline relating? In part, it's an attachment to, again, I know I said this already, but this is the main point. The attachment isn't necessarily to a parental figure, but it is to a feeling, but a feeling of what's most familiar, which is chaos, turbulence, conflict. Let's begin with the borderline way of relating, because this is where Bollas's writing comes alive. He talks about what he calls, and I quote, borderline objects. But these are people, experiences, or situations that seem to provoke emotional turbulence and draw the mind into intense, moving states. These aren't just upsetting events. They become the way through which the person connects to others and to themselves. Here's the main point. For some people with a borderline way of relating, everyday events are transformed into what Bollas calls, and I quote, a festival of suffering. In other words, ordinary distressing facts of life, disappointments, misunderstandings, workplace stress, relationship conflict, you could fill in the blank here. But they are not just noticed or felt. They become emotionally charged events that the mind cannot let go of. I'll give a couple of clinical illustrations of this in a moment. But for now, take something as everyday as a spouse, not following through on a promise. For someone with a borderline way of relating, this seemingly small frustration is transformed. It becomes a self-stimulating moment, an experience the mind repeatedly returns to, intensifying the emotional turbulence and fueling a cycle of attacking, fighting, or ruminating, turning the spouse's small failure, but it does not feel small. But the goal is to turn your spouse's failure into a focal point for blame or outrage. Why is it so necessary to react in this way? Bollas helps us understand this. Someone with a borderline organization often seeks out moments of misunderstanding or irritation, not just because they're upset, but because these moments paradoxically create a sense of connection. If your partner can bring about your distress, or if you can evoke annoyance in them, you are, I know it sounds strange, but in a strange way, you're sharing an experience together. In other words, a person with a borderline way of relating does not merely suffer distress. They use distress. They transform it into a mode for connection, however turbulent or intense it may be. And again, I know that sounds paradoxical, but bear with me. Bollas notes that people with a borderline way of relating often seek out moments of misunderstanding or uncertainty, paradoxically as a way to feel closer. That's the point. That's the main goal, because that's the familiar feeling that I mentioned earlier. It's not just about connection to a loved one in the present. These moments also echo the original bond with the primary caregiver, where the chaos and turbulence first began. When someone with a borderline way of relating stirs distress, irritation, confusion, or strong emotion in another, and can witness that reaction, they often experience it as a form of connection. As Bollas puts it, they feel that there are two of them now, two people who are sharing the experience together. In other words, two people who are worked up, two people who are upset, two people who are in it, right? You've heard that expression before when you're fighting with somebody. He describes the phenomena vividly. The person seems to take a kind of pleasure when a comment or an action is seized upon intensely, as if it gives them the chance to, and I quote, to be stirred up again. In other words, the turbulence itself becomes a bridge to closeness. And I know this must sound strange, but I'm hoping that you're beginning to understand this, because now you're not alone, you see, because you're very much connected to this feeling state and to the other person, again, who's in it with you. By playing on another's situational vulnerability, the self and the other are drawn into a brief, encapsulated merger through shared distress, a kind of intense, fleeting intimacy. It's not masochism in the simple sense. It's attachment through shared affliction. Bollas calls it a merger created not through care, but through, and I quote, anguish. The self and the other become linked by racing hearts, adrenal highs, emotional flooding, not a confusion of thought, but a merging through distress. And by the way, and I'm going to go into this more in a moment, but there doesn't even always need to be literally another person there. But I'll say more about that in a moment. Does it start to make sense why someone might actually embrace this kind of turbulence as a way of connecting? Here's the key point in this kind of borderline relating. They do not want this turbulence to end too quickly. The chaos, the emotional upheaval, the very intensity that feels uncomfortable to others and to yourself. This is the way of relating. This is what Bollas calls the object itself. The turbulence becomes the thing they cling to, the medium through which connection is experienced. It's not just about the other person's behavior. It's about the storm that keeps the bond alive. He suggests that this turbulence is actually, and I quote, the most familiar place. He says, as if you're hugging something you cannot bear, but you cannot bear to lose. And I'm going to come back to that again in a moment. So keep that one in mind, that you're hugging something that you cannot bear, but you cannot bear to lose. And then he says something devastatingly precise. I think this is a kind of mama whom you do not want to leave. Again, remember, that's the early parental figure, and this is the connection to them. The person both wants this experience and abhors it at the same time. In a way, it replaces the deficits in object constancy. Please go back to almost every earlier episode I've done in this series. I talk about the deficiency in object constancy. It creates an aliveness where there is otherwise emptiness or perhaps even a feeling of deadness. Okay. Now I hope we have a clear picture, a descriptive picture of this kind of borderline relating, and a deeper understanding of why someone needs to connect through turbulence and chaos. So now that we have that, the next step is to think about how healing might begin. But before we talk about healing, I want to briefly mention that while borderline relating clings to turbulence as a way of staying connected, narcissistic organization survives by abolishing emotional dependence on the other. Can you imagine? Can you think about what is this very different strategy? Because I'm saying they have different strategies for managing similar, they're not the same early vulnerabilities. In other words, and again, I described this in a prior episode, the early upbringing is not the same, but it's similar. And I'm asking you to imagine, what are the different strategies that somebody who's relating in a borderline way as compared to someone who is narcissistically organized? Here's the strategy, or let's say the contrast in strategies. The narcissistic contrast, control instead of turbulence. Now, this is where narcissistic organization diverges from borderline relating. There is, of course, a response to early caregiving disruption in both of them, but with narcissistic organization, the response takes a different route, where a borderline way of relating says something like this: I will find the other by intensifying feelings. Remember, it's the intense chaotic feeling that is desired. And I quote the word desired, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Now, a narcissistic way of relating says something like this: I will never again need another who can disturb me. Instead of escalating emotion, the narcissistic individual flattens affect, replaces dependency with control, and does anything to support and keep intact the grandiose sense of self. Remember, that's the main structure that holds the fragmented sense of self, the narcissistic sense of self together. That's the grandiose sense of self structure.
Let's take a quick break.
Are you tired of feeling like you're walking on eggshells all the time? Do you feel drained, confused, or like nothing you do is ever good enough? Are you stuck in a cycle of elation, then criticism and confusion? If any of this sounds familiar, you're not alone. And that's exactly why I created Office Hours with Dr. Anthony Mazzella. That's me. Office Hours is a low-cost, small group space where you could bring your questions about narcissistic traits and dynamics and the places where you feel stuck. You'll be met with honest, grounded feedback. I'll hold the group with structure, but there's also space for real conversation. This is a space designed for anyone looking for clarity, insight, and support. If that sounds like you, just click the link in the show notes to join us. Okay, I hope to see you there. Rather than seeking misunderstanding as a way of feeling close, the narcissistic style of relating seeks clarity, dominance, or more importantly, superiority as a way of staying safe. Remember, again, for those who have been following along, this is what we call the narcissistic mode of repair. The ultimate goal is not to create a storm. Instead, the other is reduced to a function that is there to provide the necessary, and I quote, narcissistic supplies. If borderline relating binds the other through shared anguish, narcissistic relating protects the self by eliminating genuine emotional dependence altogether. So while both borderline and narcissistic ways of relating emerge from early disruption, they represent opposite solutions. One clings to emotional turbulence to keep the other and oneself alive, while the other neutralizes dependence altogether in order to stay intact, to keep the grandiose sense of self intact. With these two contrasting strategies in mind, we can now turn to the question that matters. If turbulence or control once served as a way to survive early relational pain, how does healing begin? Healing, then, is not about stripping these strategies away, but about slowly creating the conditions in which connection no longer has to be built through chaos or defended through control and omnipotence. In my work, I often start by helping the person notice and make sense of this pattern in real time. The goal is not to remove the intensity or tell them to stop needing it or to calm down. The goal is to create a space where the turbulence can be witnessed, contained, and slowly transformed into something that supports connection without overwhelming the self. Let me give you a prototypical example of how I approach what Bollas calls, again, I'm quoting, a festival of suffering. This is how I approach it in practice. I might say something like this: there's something so painful about the way your relationships are experienced. Have you noticed that too? You're not just enraged, but there's frequently a deep sense of disappointment, a familiar feeling of being down again and again. And that disappointment doesn't just sit quietly, it stirs everything up inside of you. Have you noticed that? what I'm doing here is I'm not challenging the intensity. I'm not interpreting it too quickly. And I'm not yet, I put the emphasis on the word yet, I'm not yet saying there's something about the way, and I'm quoting this, you have to experience your relationships. See, that brings in unconscious motivation, that somebody like this has to experience a relationship. What I'm doing now is I'm just beginning by naming the experience. In other words, I'm beginning to show them that in this state of mind, what we often see is a kind of violent mental intensity, a relentless thinking and rethinking. Sometimes we refer to this as chuntering, right? Again and again, going over things. It can attach to almost anything. It could be their child's college applications. It could be that the nanny who might retire 2 years from today. It could be a tax deadline that is still weeks away. You could fill in the blank here, but the main point is that this thinking is often followed by a flood of talking about X, whatever X happens to be, that ultimately overwhelms the mind and exhausts the listener if there's one there. Remember, I said this can go on both intrapsychically or interpersonally. You could pull someone into it, or you could just get yourself into this worked up state of mind where you can never relax. And at a certain point, once this pattern that I'm describing right now is recognizable, then I may begin to gently shift the focus, not to the content of what they're saying, but to what the intensity itself is doing. And I might say something like this. You seem to be not just stating the facts, but that there seems to be a vested interest in this, a real stake in it, that there's something about going over this again and again that feels necessary. It satisfies a need of yours. And then I'll engage their curiosity about this. And then if they're curious, depending on how they respond, we could go a little bit further. It's almost as if you're not satisfied unless you can do it this way. And it may not be based on what your husband, if they're complaining about their husband, for instance, it may not be based on what your husband is doing, even though he may not be doing the things, be doing these things in the right way. But that sometimes when we approach it this way, you see, it opens the door to something more specific that we can begin to address. There can be a particular kind of satisfaction. I'm quoting this, okay? A kind of satisfaction. That's what I would say to them in calling your husband to task, in rehearsing it in your mind, and then bringing it to him directly. At some point, this kind of calling their husband to task, it appears in the room with me. This is what we call transference in my field. And this is where the real work can be done. Not that this other stuff isn't real work. I don't want to phrase it that way. But when something can come alive emotionally in the room, it's a good opportunity to begin to work through it, both in an affectively alive way and then with a cognitive understanding of what's happening. So I may say something like this when it comes into the room. In the same way, there's a pull to turn toward me, to tell and give me a list of what I'm doing wrong, what I don't understand, where I failed you, and even to call me to task for, it could be something as simple as ending the session on time. Separations, I mentioned this earlier in prior episodes, separations are painfully difficult, so naturally ending the session could be challenging for these individuals. And so I might say, it seems like this turbulence is a very familiar place for you, almost as if you're holding on to something you can't quite bear, but you also can't bear to let it go. There's a real conflict here. And I'm not saying this all at once, by the way. I want to emphasize that I have to feel out how they're responding to this. Are they listening? Are they curious? So if things are moving along accordingly, I may go on to say there's a real conflict here. Part of you seems to need this chaos, and another part of you hates it. Again, that's back to the earlier point that I mentioned about the conflict. When this begins to land, I often hear something like this from patients. I'm so confused because I appreciate you and I know that you've helped me quite a bit, but I'm so angry at you at the same time. And by the way, that's a good sign. See, that's the inner conflict. And this is where Bollas gives us language that feels almost unbearably precise. What he says is, and I mentioned this earlier, this is a kind of mama whom you do not want to leave. You see, there's that attachment, not just to the mama, but to the whole affective state, the turbulence, the chaos, and the fighting. There's still so much more to say about this, but if there's one thing I hope you take away from this episode, is it's that turbulence and control. Those two things are not the problem. They're signals of how desperately the person is trying to stay connected, trying to stay in a relationship. Let me know how this landed with you. I know it was a little dense, but I hope it makes a little bit of sense. And as always, feel free to reach out if you have any questions or thoughts about any of this. As always, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Take care of yourself. Bye for now. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.